The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, sat quietly in her private study. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the letter that had arrived just hours before. The elegant handwriting belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, an 82-year-old woman from a small village in Yorkshire who had written something that would change everything. Eleanor's letter was different from the thousands of others that arrived at the palace each month. It wasn't asking for anything. Instead, it was offering something precious, a story about her late husband, George, a war veteran who had spent his final years in complete silence due to a stroke that had stolen his ability to speak. Catherine read each word carefully, her heart growing heavier with every sentence. Eleanor described how George had been a vibrant storyteller before his illness, filling their home with laughter and tales from his younger days. But after the stroke, their world had become quiet. The doctor said George could hear and understand everything, but the words simply wouldn't come. What struck Catherine most was Eleanor's description of how they had learned to communicate through small gestures. A gentle squeeze of the hand meant "I love you." A soft touch on the cheek meant "thank you." Their eyes became their voices, speaking volumes without uttering a single word. Eleanor wrote about their last evening together. George had taken her hand and pressed it against his heart, then pointed to her and back to himself. She understood perfectly. His heart would always beat for her even when his own would stop. He passed away peacefully that night, leaving Eleanor with 47 years of memories and a silence that felt different now, not empty, but full of love. The letter continued with Eleanor explaining why she was writing to Catherine. She had seen the Duke and Duchess at various public events, noticing how they communicated with each other through subtle glances and gentle touches. It reminded her of the silent language she had shared with George. Eleanor wanted them to know that sometimes the most powerful conversations happen without words. Catherine wiped away tears as she finished reading. This wasn't just a letter. It was a lesson about love, loss, and the incredible strength found in quiet moments. She knew immediately that this story needed to reach William, and together they needed to do something meaningful in George and Eleanor's honor. Walking to the window, Catherine looked out at the busy London streets below. Thousands of people rushed past, probably lost in their own conversations and concerns. How many of them, she wondered, were dealing with their own silent struggles? How many couples were learning to love each other in new ways after illness had changed their lives? She thought about her own marriage to William and how blessed they were to have their voices, their laughter, their ability to share thoughts freely. Yet Eleanor's letter made her realize that some of their most meaningful moments together had indeed been wordless. A supportive touch during a difficult royal duty, a knowing look across a crowded room, or simply holding hands during quiet moments away from the public eye. Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in her private drawer. This wasn't something to be filed away and forgotten. Eleanor's courage in sharing such a personal story deserved recognition, and George's memory deserved to be honored. She knew that when William read this letter, he would feel the same pull toward action. The afternoon light shifted in the room as Catherine began planning. This story had the power to touch millions of people who might be facing similar challenges. Families dealing with illness, couples learning to communicate differently, caregivers feeling isolated. They all needed to know they weren't alone. She picked up her phone to call William, then stopped. Perhaps this was a conversation better had in person, where she could share not just Eleanor's words but also the emotions they had stirred. Some messages, Catherine realized, needed more than just words to be truly understood. As the day ended, Catherine sat once more with the letter, reading it again by lamplight. Eleanor's simple act of reaching out had planted a seed of inspiration. What started as one woman's tribute to her silent love story was about to become something much larger. A gesture that would speak to hearts around the world, about the power of love that transcends words. The palace grew quiet around her, but Catherine's mind was buzzing with possibilities. Tomorrow she would share Eleanor's story with William, and together they would find a way to honor not just George and Eleanor, but all the couples whose love stories were being written in the language of silence. Prince William arrived at Kensington Palace later than expected, his face showing the fatigue of a long day filled with royal duties and meetings. Catherine met him in their private sitting room, where she had prepared tea and placed Eleanor's letter on the small table between their chairs. You look like you have something important on your mind, William observed, settling into his chair and noticing the serious expression on his wife's face. Catherine handed him the letter without explanation, watching as his eyes moved across each line. William's demeanor changed as he read. His shoulders relaxed, then tensed again as the emotional weight of Eleanor's words settled in. When he reached the part about George's final gesture, pressing Eleanor's hand to his heart, William looked up at Catherine with tears in his eyes. "This is extraordinary," he whispered, folding the letter carefully. "She didn't ask for anything, did she? No request for a meeting, no invitation to an event. She just wanted to share their story." Catherine nodded, leaning forward in her chair. "I've been thinking about this all day. Eleanor trusted us with something incredibly personal. George served his country, then spent his final years unable to speak, yet their love remained stronger than ever. Don't you think their story deserves to be shared?" William stood and walked to the fireplace, Eleanor's letter still in his hand. "What are you thinking? A charity visit? A mention in a speech?" "Something bigger," Catherine replied, her voice gaining strength as her ideas crystallized. "What if we organized an event dedicated to couples like George and Eleanor? Families dealing with communication challenges, caregivers who feel isolated, people learning to love differently because of illness or disability." The idea energized William immediately. He turned from the fireplace, his mind already working through possibilities. "We could partner with charities that support stroke survivors, people with dementia, families affected by brain injuries. Make it about celebrating all forms of communication, not just spoken words." Catherine smiled, seeing the same spark in William's eyes that she felt in her heart. Eleanor mentioned how they developed their own language of gestures. Imagine if we could showcase that, demonstrate how love adapts and finds new ways to express itself. They spent the next hour discussing details, their excitement building with each idea. William suggested inviting couples who had similar experiences to share their stories. Catherine proposed including sign language interpreters, music therapy demonstrations, and art therapy sessions where people could express emotions without words. "We should reach out to Eleanor first," William said finally. "Ask if she would be comfortable being part of this. Her story started all of this. She should have the choice to be involved or to remain private." Catherine agreed, already composing the letter in her mind. They would need to be careful, respectful of Eleanor's grief while honoring her courage in reaching out. This wasn't about exploiting a personal tragedy for publicity. It was about creating something meaningful from Eleanor's generous sharing. Over the following days, William and Catherine worked quietly with their staff to develop the concept. They consulted with medical professionals who specialized in communication disorders, representatives from stroke associations, and counselors who worked with families facing similar challenges. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a speech therapist at a London hospital, was among the first experts they contacted. She immediately understood the vision. "You're talking about celebrating silent communication," she explained during their meeting. "Touch, facial expressions, shared activities. These become the new vocabulary for couples when traditional speech is no longer possible." The more they learned, the more William and Catherine realized how many people were living versions of George and Eleanor's story. Statistics showed millions of families worldwide were affected by conditions that impaired communication. Yet these families rarely received public recognition for their courage and adaptability. "Eleanor's letter has opened our eyes to an entire community," Catherine observed during one of their planning sessions. "These are people who have been forced to redefine what conversation means, what intimacy looks like, how to share a life when words fail." William added, "And they're doing it with such grace." Eleanor's description of George's final gesture, that wasn't desperation or sadness. It was pure love, communicated perfectly without a single word. They decided to call their initiative Silent Voices, a recognition that communication continues even when speech stops. The name honored both the challenge these families faced and the strength they demonstrated in overcoming it. As word of their project began to circulate quietly through charity networks, responses started arriving. Letters from families eager to share their own stories, offers of support from organizations, and suggestions from medical professionals who wanted to be involved. One response particularly moved them both. A woman named Maria wrote about her husband's battle with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He stopped recognizing my name months ago, she explained. But when I play his favorite song, he still reaches for my hand. We dance in our living room, and for those few minutes, we're having the most beautiful conversation imaginable. Catherine and William realized they weren't just planning an event. They were creating a movement. Eleanor's simple letter had revealed a hidden world of love stories that were being written in a completely different language. Now they had the privilege and responsibility of bringing these stories into the light. 3 weeks after receiving Eleanor's letter, Catherine stood nervously outside a modest stone cottage in the Yorkshire village of Grassington. William had wanted to come, but a last-minute royal engagement had prevented the joint visit they had planned. Catherine felt the weight of representing both of them as she approached the red wooden door. Eleanor Hayes answered on the second knock, her silver hair neatly arranged and her eyes bright, despite the sadness that seemed to hover around her like a gentle mist. She was smaller than Catherine had imagined, but there was a strength in her posture that immediately explained how she had cared for George through his illness. "Your Royal Highness," Eleanor said softly, offering a small curtsy. Catherine immediately reached for her hands. "Please call me Catherine, and thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Your letter has touched our hearts in ways I'm still trying to understand." Eleanor invited Catherine inside, and the cottage immediately revealed the life she had shared with George. Photographs covered every surface. George in his military uniform, their wedding day, holidays with children and grandchildren, and quieter moments of an ordinary life lived with extraordinary love. "I wasn't sure I should have written," Eleanor confessed as she prepared tea with slightly shaking hands. It felt presumptuous, reaching out to royalty about something so personal. Catherine helped arrange the teacups, noting how Eleanor's hands trembled, not from nervousness, she realized, but from the physical exhaustion of grief. "Eleanor, your letter was exactly what we needed to read. You shared something beautiful about love and communication that most people never get to understand." As they sat together, Eleanor began talking about George more freely. She described his personality before the stroke: quick-witted, always ready with a story or joke, the center of attention at family gatherings. "The silence was the hardest part for everyone else," Eleanor explained. "Visitors didn't know how to be around him anymore. They thought because he couldn't speak, he couldn't participate." Catherine listened intently as Eleanor described how she had learned to interpret George's expressions, the way his eyes would light up when their granddaughter visited, how he would squeeze her hand twice for yes and once for no. Their communication had become more intimate, not less. "People assumed our relationship ended when his voice did," Eleanor continued, her voice stronger now. "But in some ways we became closer. Every gesture was intentional. Every look mattered. We stopped taking each other for granted because everything required effort." Catherine shared the plans for Silent Voices, watching Eleanor's reaction carefully. She explained how George's story had inspired them to create an event celebrating all forms of communication, honoring couples who had learned to love in new ways. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "George would have loved this. He always said the best conversations he ever had with me were the ones where we didn't say anything at all, just sitting together, watching the sunset, holding hands." They discussed Eleanor's possible involvement. Catherine was careful not to pressure her, making it clear that Eleanor's privacy would be respected regardless of her decision. But Eleanor surprised her with her immediate enthusiasm. "I want to be part of this," she said firmly. "George spent 3 years unable to tell his own story. If I can tell it for him now, if it helps other families understand they're not alone, then that's what I want to do." Catherine felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had faced such loss, yet still wanted to help others. They spent the afternoon going through photo albums, with Eleanor sharing stories about George's military service, their early marriage, and the challenges they had faced together long before his illness. The stroke didn't change who he was, Eleanor emphasized. It just changed how he expressed himself. "I think that's what people don't understand. The person you love is still there even when the words are gone." As Catherine prepared to leave, Eleanor walked her to the garden where George's ashes were scattered beneath the oak tree he had planted on their 25th wedding anniversary. "I talk to him here every morning," Eleanor admitted. "I tell him about my day, about the letters I receive from people who read about his story in the local paper. I know he can't answer, but somehow I still feel like we're having conversations." Standing in that garden, Catherine understood something profound about Eleanor's letter. It hadn't been written from a place of sadness despite the loss. It had been written from a place of gratitude, gratitude for a love that had found ways to flourish even in silence. The drive back to London gave Catherine time to process the afternoon. Eleanor's courage in sharing George's story wasn't just about helping other families, it was about ensuring that George's legacy included the beautiful way he had continued to love even when words failed him. Catherine called William from the car, eager to share details of the meeting. "She's remarkable, William. Strong in a way that comes from true love, not just endurance. And she wants to help us make this bigger than we ever imagined." "How so?" William asked. "She has connections with other military families dealing with similar challenges, wives of veterans with brain injuries, families affected by PTSD-related communication difficulties. Eleanor thinks silent voices could serve an entire community that rarely gets recognition." William was quiet for a moment, then said, "This keeps growing, doesn't it?" "Eleanor's letter has revealed something much larger than one love story," Catherine agreed, watching the countryside pass by her window. "I think George and Eleanor's story was just the beginning. We're about to discover how many people have been having their own silent conversations, waiting for someone to notice how beautiful and meaningful they are." By the time Catherine reached London, she and William had outlined the next phase of their project. Eleanor's willingness to participate had given them the confidence to move forward with a larger vision, one that would honor not just her story, but thousands of stories like it. The Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre in London had never hosted an event quite like Silent Voices. As Catherine and William walked through the venue 3 days before the gathering, they could see their vision taking shape in ways that exceeded their expectations. The main hall had been transformed into different zones, each representing a unique form of nonverbal communication. In one corner, a music therapy area featured instruments and comfortable seating where couples could communicate through rhythm and melody. Another section displayed art therapy stations with canvases, clay, and various materials that allowed expression without words. "Look at this," William said, stopping at a display prepared by the British Sign Language Association. Professional interpreters would be stationed throughout the event, not just to translate for deaf attendees, but to demonstrate the beauty and complexity of sign language as a complete form of communication. Catherine was particularly drawn to the touch therapy area, where occupational therapists would demonstrate how physical touch could convey complex emotions and thoughts. Massage chairs, textured materials, and guided exercises would show families new ways to connect when traditional conversation became difficult. Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached them, carrying a folder thick with stories. "We've received over 300 responses from families wanting to participate," she reported. "The demand is far beyond what any of us anticipated." The stories Dr. Mitchell shared were both heartbreaking and inspiring. A father who communicated with his autistic son through elaborate drawings they created together. A couple in their 70s who had developed an entire vocabulary of hand signals after the wife lost her hearing. A young mother who sang lullabies to her husband recovering from a traumatic brain injury, using music to bridge the gap while his speech returned slowly. "Each family has developed their own unique language," Dr. Mitchell explained. "What Silent Voices is doing is validating these alternative forms of communication and showing that love doesn't require words to be profound." Eleanor Hayes had arrived in London the day before. Staying at a small hotel near the venue, Catherine visited her that evening, finding Eleanor both nervous and excited about the next day's event. "I never imagined George's story would lead to something like this," Eleanor said as they sat in the hotel's quiet lounge. "He was such a private man even before his illness. But I think he would be proud knowing his experience might help other families feel less alone." Catherine had brought photo albums from some of the families who would be attending, sharing Eleanor's story with others who had experienced similar journeys. "They all mention the same thing you wrote about," Catherine observed, "how their relationships became more intentional, more precious when they had to work harder to communicate." One story particularly resonated with Eleanor. A woman named Janet had written about her husband's recovery from a stroke similar to George's. She says they discovered that they had been taking conversation for granted. Catherine read aloud. "Now every successful communication feels like a victory they've won together." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly right. When George would manage to communicate something complex through gestures, it felt like we had accomplished something extraordinary together. Every understanding became a celebration. The morning of the Silent Voices event, William and Catherine arrived early to greet the families and participants. The atmosphere was unlike any royal event they had previously hosted, quieter, more intimate but charged with emotional energy. Eleanor was among the first to arrive, accompanied by her daughter Susan and grandson Michael. Catherine introduced her to other families, watching as immediate connections formed between people who understood each other's experiences without lengthy explanations. The opening ceremony was deliberately simple. William began with brief remarks acknowledging that the most meaningful conversations often happen without words. Then, instead of a traditional speech, they presented a video montage of couples demonstrating their unique forms of communication. George and Eleanor's story was featured prominently, with Eleanor narrating over photographs and home videos she had shared. The audience watched in respectful silence as Eleanor described their final evening together. George's hand pressed against her heart, their eyes saying everything that words could not. The impact was immediate and profound. Tissues were passed quietly through the crowd as people recognized their own experiences reflected in George and Eleanor's journey. But rather than sadness, the dominant emotion was recognition and validation. Following the opening, families moved freely between the different stations. Catherine and William split up to spend time in various areas, learning about different communication methods and listening to personal stories. At the music therapy station, Catherine met David and Margaret, a couple in their 60s. Margaret had lost her ability to speak due to throat cancer, but David had learned to play simple melodies on a keyboard that corresponded to different emotions and needs. They demonstrated their system, with Margaret touching David's hand in specific patterns to indicate which song she wanted him to play. We have songs for I love you, I'm worried, I'm happy, and even I disagree with you, David explained with a laugh. Our conversations are more musical now, but they're still conversations. William spent extended time at the touch therapy area, where he met Robert, a military veteran whose traumatic brain injury had affected his speech processing. Robert's wife, Anne, had developed an elaborate system of shoulder touches, hand squeezes, and gentle pressure points that helped Robert feel grounded and understood. People think touch is simple, Anne explained, but we've learned it can be incredibly sophisticated. I can calm his anxiety, show support, express affection, or even disagree with something, all through different types of physical contact. The highlight of the day came when Eleanor agreed to participate in a panel discussion about adapting to communication challenges. Sitting alongside 5 other caregivers and family members, she spoke about the journey she and George had taken together. I want people to understand that silence doesn't mean absence, Eleanor told the audience. George was present with me every single day until he died. We just learned to be present differently. A woman in the audience raised her hand. How did you know you were understanding him correctly? How could you be sure you weren't just imagining the communication you wanted to see? Eleanor smiled gently. Because love teaches you to listen with more than your ears. When you've been with someone for 47 years, you learn to hear their heart speaking. George's eyes never stopped talking to me. I just had to learn their language. As the day ended, Catherine and William realized that Silent Voices had become more than an event. It had become a community. Families were exchanging contact information, forming support networks, and planning to stay in touch. Eleanor had become a mentor figure, with several younger caregivers asking if they could write to her for advice and encouragement. Standing in the emptying venue, surrounded by the evidence of a day filled with meaningful connection and communication, Catherine and William understood that Eleanor's simple letter had sparked something much larger than they had ever anticipated. 6 months after the Silent Voices event, Catherine received an unexpected phone call from Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor's voice carried an excitement that Catherine hadn't heard since their first meeting. Catherine, dear, you'll never believe what's happened, Eleanor began, her words rushing together in her enthusiasm. The hospital in Leeds wants to create a permanent program based on what we did at Silent Voices. They're calling it the George Hayes Communication Center. Catherine set down her morning tea, giving Eleanor her full attention. Eleanor, that's wonderful. Tell me everything. Eleanor explained that Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of neurology at Leeds General Hospital, had attended the Silent Voices event and been deeply moved by the stories shared that day. She had approached Eleanor about developing a comprehensive program for families dealing with communication challenges caused by stroke, brain injury, and other neurological conditions. They want to create a space where families can learn different communication methods before they're desperate, Eleanor continued, not waiting until traditional speech therapy reaches its limits, but introducing alternative communication from the beginning. The program would include the techniques demonstrated at Silent Voices: music therapy, touch communication, art expression, and sign language, but in a medical setting where families could receive ongoing support and training. Eleanor had been asked to serve as a patient advocate and program advisor. But here's the most amazing part, Eleanor added, her voice dropping to a whisper. They want to name the main therapy room after George. There will be a plaque explaining his story and how it inspired this whole program. Catherine felt tears in her eyes. George's legacy was expanding beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined when she first wrote her letter. Eleanor, George would be so proud. His story is helping families before they face the challenges you two overcame. Over the following weeks, Catherine and William stayed closely involved with the development of the George Hayes Communication Center. They visited the hospital during construction, meeting with staff and reviewing the program design. Dr. Williams showed them through the facility, explaining how each room was designed with specific communication methods in mind. The music therapy room featured both traditional instruments and technology that could translate emotions into musical tones. The art therapy space included adaptive tools for patients with limited mobility, and the touch communication room provided comfortable settings for families to practice and learn physical communication techniques. What makes this program unique, Dr. Williams explained, is that we're teaching families to see communication challenges as opportunities for different kinds of intimacy, rather than just obstacles to overcome. William was particularly interested in the family support component of the program. Eleanor mentioned that visitors often felt uncomfortable around George because they didn't know how to communicate with him. How are you addressing that? Dr. Williams smiled. That's where Eleanor's insight has been invaluable. We're including extended family and friends in the training. Children, grandchildren, longtime friends. Anyone who wants to maintain their relationship with the patient can learn these communication methods. The program's approach was revolutionary in its positivity. Rather than focusing on what patients had lost, it emphasized what they could gain: deeper nonverbal connection, heightened sensitivity to emotional cues, and more intentional expressions of love and care. Eleanor threw herself into the program development with energy that surprised everyone, including herself. She attended planning meetings, reviewed training materials, and worked with staff to develop family support protocols based on her own experience. I never expected to find a new purpose at 82, Eleanor confided to Catherine during one of their regular phone calls. But helping other families avoid the isolation we felt in those first months after George's stroke, it feels like the most important work I've ever done. The program attracted attention from medical centers across the country. Requests poured in for information about replicating the George Hayes model in other hospitals. Eleanor found herself traveling to speaking engagements, sharing George's story and the lessons she had learned about alternative communication. During one particularly moving presentation at a hospital in Manchester, Eleanor addressed a room full of families who were just beginning their journey with communication challenges. I won't lie to you, she told them. Losing the ability to have traditional conversations with someone you love is heartbreaking. But what you'll discover is that love finds new ways to express itself. George and I had some of our most intimate conversations after he lost his ability to speak. A woman in the audience asked the question Eleanor heard at every presentation. How do you know if you're really communicating or just hoping you are? Eleanor's answer had evolved through months of reflection. You know because the connection feels real. When George touched my hand in a certain way, I felt his love just as clearly as when he used to tell me he loved me. Sometimes more clearly, because the gesture required such effort and intention. The success of the George Hayes Communication Center led to an unexpected invitation. The Royal College of Speech and Language. Therapists asked Catherine and William to become patrons of a new national initiative to implement similar programs in hospitals throughout the United Kingdom. During the ceremony announcing their patronage, William reflected on how Eleanor's letter had started a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. Eleanor Hayes wrote to us about love and loss, about finding new ways to communicate when traditional methods fail, William said in his remarks. She couldn't have known that her personal story would inspire a medical revolution, changing how we think about communication and connection. Catherine added, George Hayes never had the opportunity to benefit from programs like the one now bearing his name. But his legacy ensures that thousands of other families will have resources and support that he and Eleanor created through their own love and determination. After the ceremony, Eleanor approached them with tears in her eyes. George was always proud of his military service, but I think he would be even more proud of this, she said, gesturing toward the presentation materials about the national program. His final years of silence are now helping other families find their voices. Catherine hugged Eleanor tightly. This is just the beginning, Eleanor. George's story is going to help families for generations to come. As they left the ceremony together, Catherine realized that Eleanor's simple act of writing a letter had demonstrated the very principle she had written about. Sometimes the most powerful communications require no words at all, just the courage to reach out and connect with another human being. 2 years after Eleanor's letter first arrived at Kensington Palace, Catherine stood once again in Eleanor's Yorkshire garden, but this time she wasn't alone. Eleanor had invited 12 families who had been helped by the George Hayes Communication Center to join them for a special memorial gathering. The oak tree where George's ashes rested had grown noticeably in the past 2 years, its branches reaching higher and wider, providing shade for the assembled group. Eleanor, now 84 but with renewed energy from her advocacy work, moved among her guests with quiet confidence. George would have loved this chaos, Eleanor said to Catherine, gesturing toward the scene around them. Children were playing quietly on the lawn while their parents and grandparents shared stories and experiences. He always said our garden was too quiet. Today it's full of life and conversation. Among the families present was David and Margaret, the couple who communicated through music. They had brought their keyboard and demonstrated for the group how their musical language had expanded over 2 years of practice. What started as simple melodies for basic needs had evolved into complex compositions that could express detailed thoughts and emotions. We can have arguments in B-flat now, David joked, earning laughter from the group. But we can also say, I'm proud of you, and I remember when, and let's plan for tomorrow. Our vocabulary keeps growing. Robert and Anne, the military couple who had developed touch communication, shared how their system had helped Robert's recovery progress beyond what doctors had originally predicted. The physical connection helped my brain create new pathways, Robert explained, his speech much clearer than it had been at the first Silent Voices event. Anne's touch wasn't just comfort, it was therapy. Eleanor listened to each story with deep satisfaction. These families had found their own versions of what she and George had discovered, that love could adapt, grow, and even flourish when forced to find new expressions. William had wanted to attend the gathering but was representing the royal family at an overseas engagement. However, he had arranged for a special surprise. A courier arrived during the afternoon with a package addressed to Eleanor. Inside was a leather-bound book titled Silent Voices, Stories of Love Beyond Words. William and Catherine had compiled the stories from families involved in the George Hayes Communication Center program, creating a permanent record of how alternative communication had transformed their relationships. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the book to find George's photograph on the dedication page, along with the words, for George Hayes, whose silent love speaks louder than words, and for Eleanor Hayes, whose courage in sharing their story has helped thousands of families find their own voices. Will you read George's story to us? Asked Janet, the woman whose husband had recovered from a stroke similar to George's. I've told others about it, but I'd love to hear you tell it in your own words. Eleanor settled into a garden chair, the book in her lap, surrounded by families whose lives had been touched by her decision to write a letter to strangers 2 years earlier. She began not with George's illness, but with their early years together, his laughter, his storytelling, the vibrant conversations that had filled their home. George taught me that communication was about connection, not just words, Eleanor said, looking around at the attentive faces. When his words were taken away, the connection remained. We just had to learn to hear each other differently. She described their final evening together, George pressing her hand to his heart, their eyes speaking what voices could not express. But this time Eleanor's account included something new: hope. "I used to think that evening was about goodbye," Eleanor said softly. "But sitting here with all of you, seeing how George's story has helped your families, I realize it was about something else entirely. It was about the beginning of a legacy. A young mother named Sarah, whose toddler had been born with a rare neurological condition affecting speech development, approached Eleanor after the reading. "My daughter may never speak normally," Sarah said, "but after learning about George and participating in your program, I'm not afraid anymore. We'll find our own language." Eleanor took Sarah's hands in hers. "And it will be beautiful, dear. Different from what you expected, perhaps, but beautiful in its own way." As the afternoon stretched into evening, the families began sharing their own memorial plans. Several couples had decided to create their own annual gatherings, spreading the network of support that had grown from Eleanor's simple letter. Dr. Williams arrived as the day was ending, bringing news that the George Hayes Communication Center model was now being implemented in 15 hospitals across the United Kingdom, with plans for expansion to 25 more facilities within the next year. "Eleanor, you've started a revolution in how we think about communication in medical settings," Dr. Williams announced. "The preliminary results show that families who participate in our program report higher satisfaction, better coping mechanisms, and stronger relationships than those who receive only traditional speech therapy." Eleanor smiled, looking around at the families gathered in George's memory. "George would say that love always finds a way. We just gave it some help." As the gathering concluded, Catherine helped Eleanor clean up, the two women working in comfortable silence that had become their own form of communication. Their friendship, which began with a letter about silent love, had developed its own wordless understanding. "What's next for you, Eleanor?" Catherine asked as they folded chairs and collected teacups. Eleanor paused, looking toward the oak tree where evening light filtered through the leaves. "I think George and I have one more conversation to have," she said mysteriously. "I want to tell him about everything that's grown from his story. And then I think I'd like to write another letter." Catherine looked up with interest. "Another letter?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes twinkling with familiar determination. "There are other stories that need telling, other families who might benefit from knowing they're not alone." George's story was just the beginning. As Catherine drove back to London that evening, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Eleanor's letter. What started as one woman's tribute to her husband's silent love had become a national movement, helping thousands of families discover new ways to communicate and connect. But perhaps most remarkably, Eleanor herself had been transformed. From a grieving widow writing a letter to strangers, she had become an advocate, a mentor, and a voice for families facing their own silent challenges. George's legacy lived on not just in the programs and centers bearing his name, but in Eleanor's ongoing commitment to helping others find love beyond words. The last light of day faded as Catherine reached London, but she knew that somewhere in Yorkshire, Eleanor was sitting by an oak tree, having another conversation with George, a conversation that needed no words, only love, and would continue to inspire others long after both their voices had joined the eternal silence.